I'd heard from my professors, they drilled it into us, that it's the data point that doesn't fit that leads to scientific discoveries and new insight, and I believe they had one, and with that fantastic movie last night, I believe even stronger that they have one with LMHRs. Well, if you go into space exploration, you're going to be a rock star, and you're going to be the life of any party you attend. But if you go into climate science, industry's coming for you, because the thing you hear over and over and over again is you can't infer causality from observational data. What? I don't think I had ever heard that before.
For our next speaker, we have a Stanford-educated earth scientist with 17 years of field experience who helped build OS powering both OS X and iOS with Steve Jobs, and has been passionate about longevity since his early days as Jack LaLanne's caddy. Please welcome Chris MacAskill.
Thanks. The only thing is, speaking for Steve Jobs, he would have insisted that we say OS 10, not OS X. So my talk is how I believe big data will revolutionize nutrition, as it has almost every other field I've ever been involved in. Let's see how this clicker works. Look at that. My alternative title that I amused myself with was, "Who let the vegan in here, Dave?" Hey, that photo is of Austrian's new dietary guidelines, and they've got red meat in there, and yogurt, and cheese, and eggs. So I have so much respect for what Dave is doing with this conference, because he likes to hear other voices, many voices combined. And I feel the same way, and that's why I had Nick and Dave on my Viva Longevity YouTube channel, because I thought, I'd heard from my professors, they drilled it into us, that it's the data point that doesn't fit that leads to scientific discoveries and new insight, and I believe they had one, and with that fantastic movie last night, I believe even stronger that they have one with LMHRs. This guy changed my life, Steve Jobs, because he had a philosophy of hiring people with different points of view and hearing them out. He had done it many times before. This is the core Macintosh team, and that is Joanna Hoffman. She had a PhD in Middle East archaeology. What is she doing as the product manager of the original Macintosh? That's Bill Atkinson. He was working on his PhD in neurochemistry when Steve hired him to help develop the Macintosh, and that's Andy Hertzfeld. And I was gonna say, he is the most passionate software engineer I've ever seen in my life. He would say, we poured love into the computer and it radiated it back to us on the screen. He hired Susan Kerr, who changed the world of art, who gave the Macintosh personality. And last night's movie, I was thinking, well, maybe Dave is almost as passionate as Andy, or more so. So this is the computer we were developing. Steve had left Apple for whatever reason and wanted to build a new computer, and the way he saw it was more robust, it wouldn't crash as often, and it would play stereo music and so on. But I saw it, I had been an earth scientist for 17 years, and the idea of me going into Next Computer and interviewing for a job just didn't seem reasonable. But the way I saw it is big data. I'd been involved in big data, and this computer could support multiprocessors, and you could gang them together to solve big problems. You could have a whole room of them together. So we just had a different point of view, and Steve and I argued back and forth on many things. It wasn't that it was always congenial, it was that we all wanted to hear everybody else's point of view. And then when Apple bought Next, and our operating system drove the renaissance that became Apple, because it became the operating system it became OS 10, and also the operating system for the iPhone. They spent 5 years struggling to develop that operating system, and it ended up changing the world. Well, then Joanna, Andy, and Bill started a new company, and they recruited me as an early employee, General Magic, and their idea was to put a little magic in your pocket and develop what we were thinking of as a smartphone. This was in 1994. And we were ahead of our time in terms of electronics, wireless networks, and so on, so we couldn't make it commercial as we wanted. But the engineers and scientists who helped with this project went on to Apple, developed the iPhone, went on to Google through a circuitous route and developed the Android phones. And Bill and Andy and Joanna changed the world a second time. And now it just freaks me out whenever I go to a conference and see an audience like this, and they hold up their phones and turn on the light. Everyone has got one in their pocket. We were in Uganda a few months ago, very poor people, and everyone had one, even though they didn't have agricultural equipment beyond a hoe. So when I was a young teen, this is when my interest in nutrition got started, because I had a side hustle of caddying at the Rinda Country Club, and there were a lot of celebrities who came there, and this was Jack LaLanne. This photo was taken when he was almost 40 years old. The caddy master made the fateful decision of assigning me as his caddy, and I would talk to Jack as we went around the golf course, and he would lecture me on nutrition. He was influenced by being raised by his mom, who was a Seventh-day Adventist. He was influenced by Ansel Keys. I know he's probably not your favorite person in the world, but he was a towering figure in those days because of his best-selling books and the cover of Time magazine and so on, promoting the Mediterranean diet. But my father was interested in books like this. Jack was a TV star. He had a show for 36 years and a Hollywood star. Dr. Carlton Fredericks was a radio star. He had a show for 30 years, 6 days a week for an hour. It was a call-in show. I've got, by the way, all the books that I'm going to show in this presentation are out in the lobby. They're free to take. A lot of them are historical, like this one. We have 2 copies of that. You're free to look through or take one as you wish. And my father raised us on meat and cheese, ham and cheese omelets and bacon and eggs for breakfast and steaks. But he was a big hunter, so he hunted pheasants and ducks and geese. And I remember very distinctly as we were eating dinner, the sound of clinking because we would spit out the lead shot. Some people remember that. It was just a matter of routine. If you didn't swallow it, then out on the plate it went and clink, clink, clink. That was before the days of Herb Needleman. Herb was he started as a pediatrician. He became involved in epidemiology because he was concerned about lead poisoning in children. And he's one of my great heroes because of the epidemiology he and other scientists did in the 70s to finally get us to realize that lead was a threat. This was a desk like I had in my 2nd grade, and it had an inkwell in it, and I filled it with mercury, which was really easy to get at the local drugstore. It was cheap. And it made me very popular because you could dip your quarters and dimes in there, and it would provide a really nice luster finish on the quarters and dimes. And sometimes we would take a little bit of mercury and scatter it around on the tile floor, and the beads would dance around, and nobody thought anything of it. But ironically, years later, by the way, I talked to my dad about Jack because his views were completely opposite of Carlton Fredericks. He was telling me to eat 10 veggies and 5 fruits every single day. And it's like, what? Who does that? I would like my dad's steaks. And so I talked to my dad about it, and Dad would say, he's a muscle man, which was the gym rat sort of gym bro back in the day. And Carlton Fredericks is a doctor, and that landed with me. So I just didn't think that much about nutrition for a long time. But when I went into earth science, geophysics is my background, I ended up, ironically, in a company that had 34 water testing labs around the nation. And we ended up getting samples from mines, which had lead and arsenic in the water, from chemical plants, which dumped solvents in the river, and from poultry farms in the Chesapeake Bay drainage area because they had the problem of so much poop. What do they do with this concentrated poop? And it would get into the groundwater table and into the streams and go to the Chesapeake Bay and poison the fish and the crabs. And the fishermen would say, hey, you're destroying our livelihood. And they would try to sue, and the chicken farmers would say, you're trying to destroy our livelihood. And you had industry against industry. I have to tell you that environmental epidemiology is depressing because every industry reacts the same way, like they did with Herb Needleman. They will do anything to discredit your science, say you're fudging your data, that you're an alarmist or a bully or whatever it is that they say, and they will torture you throughout your life. And it's hard for you to come to grips with the idea that You're doing this as a passion project, maybe part of your career, but you're taking it on the chin because you were a pediatrician and were tired of seeing kids with lead poisoning, and they're running ads about how lead is healthy. They were running the tobacco industry playbook about 30 years before the tobacco industry wrote that playbook, because every industry does this, and the playbook is obvious. Promote the product, fund your own science that conflicts with the science that Herb Needleman is putting out, and so on. So suppose you're me, and you have, suppose you're one of my friends, and they get a PhD in physics, and they have an opportunity to go to NASA. And I always have to tell them, well, if you go into space exploration, you're going to be a rock star, and you're going to be the life of any party you attend. But if you go into climate science, industry's coming for you, and they're going to convince half the nation that you're evil and a liar, and you have some other kind of motivation, and when you go to the party, people are going to bring the rage, and you're going to have to deal with that. So if you see this photo and you say, hey, that looks like Joanna Hoffman, you have very good eyes. You've seen the Steve Jobs movie, but that's not Joanna Hoffman, that's Kate Winslet. She got a Golden Globe for her portrayal of Joanna Hoffman in a Steve Jobs movie, and we were just at Joanna's home 3 weeks ago for a 35-year reunion of General Magic, and we were all teasing her that she was Kate. And one reason that Joanna became such a rock star, along with the others, is because it's in Apple's financial interest to make her a rock star, whereas in climate science, it's in Exxon and Koch brothers' interest to make you look like an idiot, like your science is illegitimate. As life wore on, I became aware of all my many risk factors. If you're wondering why I have a hole in my head, here's your partial answer. You're lucky I took this photo 2 weeks after the initial operation. And as I kept learning about more and more risk factors that I had, when I was 42 years old, I had a carotid ultrasound test that showed I had moderate atherosclerosis. And so I began to think, maybe I should use a little bit of my environmental epidemiology background and see if I can make some sense out of all the noise that I'm seeing. My father was declining in his 60s. My hero athletic father, who was captain of his hockey team at Queens, he got high blood pressure, he got gout, and by the time he was 70, he had died of a heart attack. Whereas Jack decided to pull 70 boats for TV with 70 people in them to show how vigorous he was on his 70th birthday. He did that handcuffed and shackled at the ankles. That's Jack, that lower white dot you see leading those boats, swimming a mile, pulling those boats. It's just unbelievable that anybody could do that. But in the meantime, the doctors that my dad adored so much, none of them made it out of their 70s, which I knew was just an anecdote, but it still was like, the one on the left, Blake Donaldson, these books are all out in the lobby. Blake Donaldson on the left was a carnivore doctor, the rest were low carb. But Jack kept making the news because he was so vigorous until he was 96 years old. I mean, he wanted to swim, his wife stopped him, but he wanted to swim to Catalina Island from Los Angeles on his 90th birthday. So when I was in tech for many decades, I saw big data keep changing the world, and one of those cases was Google. There were many search engines when Google came out, and when these two graduate students tried to sell their search engine to Excite and Yahoo for $1 million, they all passed it by and said, no, search is going to get to be too noisy when the internet gets big. But they had big data backgrounds, and so with Yahoo, their feeling was you're going to have to do human curation of the internet. Some of you may remember that they had a directory and humans were curating the internet. But Google decided they were going to hire a lot of PhD scientists and combine them with engineers, kind of the thing that Dave likes to do. And they created this search engine, and they just crushed everyone else by using their statistical methods. When someone from another field of epidemiology comes into nutrition, it is a shock. It causes your jaw just to drop. Adrian and I were just talking about this in the back room, because the thing you hear over and over and over again is you can't infer causality from observational data. What? I don't think I had ever heard that before. And it's your job in environmental epidemiology to infer cause. Everyone expects it. You can't be Herb Needleman and say, well, I don't know if, we need an RCT with lead. Can you bring your kids in and we'll feed them paint chips? And there are these great books. There's a dozen great books. Adrian showed some of them on inferring causality from observational data. UC Berkeley alone has over a dozen statisticians, scientists who list causal inference as part of their jobs. So when I came in, my professors told us, they drilled into us, you don't be that person who tries to read thousands of scientific papers and thinks they know science after that. You be that person who does a deep dive on the papers that really matter, that made a difference one way or the other to prove or disprove a hypothesis. And one of the first ones I came across was this very famous one, still famous today, from 1957, about fat in the diet. And there was a movie, Fat Fiction, that featured this paper front and center. One of the things I noticed with this paper is that there was only one very poor scan of it, and it was on CrossFit's site. And I was having trouble connecting the dots, which country is which here. And they showed an alternative graph which had the same idea, but they didn't have any notation at all. So I decided, okay, I'm going to scan this paper, or I'm going to convert it to a searchable PDF and annotate this and make it public so anybody can access it. And that means you guys. So the first thing, if you have an environmental epidemiology background, the first thing to jump out is the lead author, Jakob Yerushalmi. He was known as Yak in the day, and he was a very famous professor of statistical biology at UC Berkeley. He was known for torturing Richard Dahl and Bradford Hill, the two people who were involved in the famous British smoking study that went 50 years. And because that study had inferred that lung cancer was causal, or smoking was causal of lung cancer, and Bradford Hill was very famous. This book, which is out in the lobby, went through 12 editions and was the medical statistical textbook for 50 years, I think. But Yak denied that there was a causal link between smoking and lung cancer until the day he died in 1973, 9 years after the Surgeon General's report was out. So in character with Yak, when he published this paper in 1957 that has now become so famous, he led with this famous 6-country graph. It includes England and Australia and Canada and so on, that Ansel Keys had displayed in 1953 at a hospital that showed a very strong correlation between fat in the diet, any fat in the diet, and heart disease. And he had access to data from 22 countries, and when he plotted that, it looked, the correlation was definitely not as strong. And the movie Fat Fiction claimed that it just became a scattergram and there was no correlation whatsoever. But this is one of the reasons why I put this paper, made it readable and publicly available on the internet, is so that people could read it. A correlation of 0 means no correlation. A correlation of 1 means a perfect correlation. And these numbers, to me, look fairly significant. And you notice that he even isolated animal fat and animal protein, which having pretty strong correlation coefficients, from vegetable fat and vegetable protein, which had negative correlations, meaning they were associated with reduced risk of heart disease, and animal fat and animal protein was associated with higher. Now, at this point, you're probably saying, Dave, who let this vegan in the room? This is not going well. And they even noticed the negative correlation with carbohydrate, too. And to that, I'll say, if I were to go down the hall or the street and speak at the vegan conference, low-fat vegan conference, where they recommend you don't have avocados and nuts and olive oil and things like that, I would get the same side-eye glances as I'm getting here. And the point is that they could learn a lot from you, and hopefully we can learn a lot from each other. So if you go back and look at how an epidemiologist would look at this chart, how did this graph get? where it is. Oh, the point of his paper, the point of his entire paper, was that protein had a stronger correlation than fat did, and you can see that this correlation is quite strong. So, but the point of the paper was he fudged his data. Ansel Keys fudged his data. He cherry-picked 6 countries when he had access to 22. Well, if you look at this from an epidemiological point of view, the thing about epidemiology is a well-characterized population with a large difference in effect size is what you're looking for. And you'll see here that the effect size difference between Japan, Finland, and USA was the highest. Finland's off the chart to the left, but they chose that as one of the ones to be in there. You'll also notice that Netherlands was way off to the right, way further than France, but it had a very low heart attack rate. So they chose that because the scatter is scientifically fascinating. It could be bad FAO data, or it could be that they could learn something from the data point that doesn't fit. You don't know unless you investigate, and that's what they decided to do. And since Australia, Canada, and England, which he had on the original chart, were kind of in the center, off the chart they went. So now we had 5 countries. How do you select the other 2? Because they went to 7 countries. Well, one of the things you're looking for is you want a good scientific team, and this is going to be an expensive study, so you better get countries that can fund it. So what they did is you'll see that Greece and Yugoslavia are not on this chart. They didn't have data for them, and that was important for blinding. So of the 16 cohorts, 7 of them were blinded. They had no idea what the relationship was. They wrote a book. I have it here. It's out in the lobby. It's the only team I've ever seen that published an entire book on their study, and you can read it. But the idea of their cohorts is they were looking for a well-characterized cohort that had enough people, so they were going to rural cohorts who had eaten the same foods they'd eaten for decades and would for a couple decades more before getting invaded by McDonald's and so on. And they had to bring a team of doctors in every 6 months to measure their exposure because you couldn't expect these people to fill out a questionnaire. So they collected the food that they were eating and they sent them to the lab frozen, and then they analyzed the chemistry. And what did they find? A chart you probably won't like seeing, which is after 50 years, they published this paper about the saturated fat content of their diet. And you'll notice that Japan had the lowest, Finland had the highest, and that when you you increased the amount of saturated fat in the diet by 5, the heart attack death rate increased by 9. And you may say, wait a minute, there's no data that supports this. Well, I see it everywhere. In fact, the French epidemiologist Serge Renaud was very famous for showing that in Brittany, in the north of France, they had 4 times the heart attack death rate and 5 times lower mortality than people did on the Riviera, where they were eating fish and vegetables instead of meat and cheese. So on this team, I talked to Henry Blackburn a lot. He's the guy who's 99 and a half. He's about to turn 100 in a month, and he's still playing in his band. I calculated and had AI calculate the odds that 3 members of an 18-person scientific team would live past 100, and it blew AI's mind. AI said, you know, it's got to be 1 in 10 billion. One AI said it's 1 in a billion. I tried to calculate it, and I got somewhere about less than 1 in a billion. And there are many members of the team that are still alive, like Alessandro. I'm thinking of interviewing him. He's 91. So moving on, this whole idea that epidemiology cannot infer cause. Science magazine wrote an article, published an article in 1995 saying epidemiology has faced its limits. It doesn't have the large effect sizes anymore. They've chased down smoking and so on. And it's creating these false positives that are scaring everyone. 28, and they listed 53 that were suspected false positives. 28 years later, a group of epidemiologists followed up on those 53 items to see which of them were false positives. And it turns out that big data gets better as time goes on, because over the next 30 years from when that paper was published, Harvard alone added 200,000 people to their studies, and 30 years. That's a lot of data. And the Framingham Heart Study has been going on for 75 years. I'm the only one, I think, with camera rolling to tour their campus. It's on my site and interview the director of Framingham. There's 150 scientists and technicians involved in that. They bring their patients in every 2 years and measure everything for 7 hours on those patients. Bone density scans, glucose responses. This kind of data is data an environmental epidemiologist, by the way, we all trust that, you're not eating lead, would dream of. It's just, you don't get that kind of data except in nutritional epidemiology. So even the Washington Post listed a century of medical milestones, and they had the Framingham study as one of the 10 most profound medical milestones of the last century after infectious disease control, immunization, and vitamins. So here's an example of the many things that the Science article listed that were probably false positives. Alcohol and breast cancer, tanning beds and melanoma. There were a lot of them that we now just completely accept as absolutely, it was causal. The epidemiology didn't get it wrong. And I didn't see any of the 53 things. Many of them are still indeterminate, but pretty suspicious. So here's where we are, here's where we were in the 60s when I began my journey. We had a TV star and a radio star, and they were saying exactly opposite things. And here's where we are today. We have a group of stars who believe passionately that their diet is the one. You're all part of that. And down the street, we have a group of people who believe passionately their diet is the one. So what is a consumer to do? I think you've heard this from everywhere. How, for every doctor who believes one diet is the one, there is another doctor who believes the exact opposite diet is the one. So what are you going to do? Well, first of all, I think we ought to be humble about where we are in America, because we are here on that chart where that red arrow is. Highest health expenditures, lowest life lived. The interesting thing is the food guides that have epidemiologists on their committees are enormously consistent. They all look the same. There's 114 of them that we were able to identify. I have a whole spreadsheet of it, which I made public, and we interviewed food guide professionals from Switzerland, Japan, Norway, the US, and I forget all else who we did. They have visual food guides that are just like ours. Look, Japan has carbs at the base. Their obesity rate is only 5%. So what's going on? I'm going to skip that Yahoo slide. I did an episode on the Japanese lunch program. They have a dietitian in every school who teaches from the kids and designs the menus from their food guide. So what in the world is that slide doing there? So you may wonder, how in the world do I think, the initial title was How Big Data Will Revolutionize Nutrition. How in the world do I think that's possible? I think it's possible because the nations who are leading us, like Denmark, who banned trans fats 15 years before us, they lead us in everything. They now have an action plan for plant-based foods. Doesn't mean it can't be keto. It can be fully keto. And do I remember what this slide was supposed to say? It's my concluding slide. I should. I can't read my show notes over there, so I've been making things up as I go along. It just reminds me, this is one of my heroes, James Hansen. He testified to Congress in 1986, I think. Carl Sagan had testified the year before, 1988. And in that time, we had passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. We had done all these wonderful things. And after he gave that talk, George H.W. Bush said, people who are afraid we won't be able to control the greenhouse effect are underestimating the White House effect. That's how I think about big data. It gets better, it gets irrefutable, It's led every country that I can think of to a very high-quality food guide, like Uganda and everywhere else. They all have independent scientists, they all have statisticians, and so I believe that will happen in nutrition too. And I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming, Chris. Big round of applause. Let's prove we're the collaborative science conference.